December 22nd, 1299. On the plains of Wadi al-Haznadar in Syria, one of history's strangest coalitions was forming. Mongol archers stood shoulder to shoulder with Armenian Crusader knights. Georgian cavalry lined up beside Turkish warriors. And commanding this unlikely alliance was Ghazan Khan, a Mongol ruler who had converted to Islam just 4 years earlier. Their opponent? The Mamluk army of Egypt, also Muslim. This was a paradox of history. The same Mongols who had devastated Baghdad and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Muslims were now, in a strange twist, defending the remnants of the Crusader states. But was this truly a rescue, or simply the last illusion of a doomed dream? Before we explore this bizarre encounter, we need to rewind 39 years to understand its origins. September 3rd, 1260, Valley of Ain Jalut, Palestine. Imagine being a Mongol warrior under General Kitbuka. For 2 decades, your empire had swept across the known world, conquering China, Persia, and Levant, leaving terror in its wake. The Mongols had turned cities into ashes and redefined what it meant to be invincible. Baghdad, the jewel of Islam, had fallen in flames. Defeat was a concept foreign to your vocabulary, until today. Facing the Mongols were 20,000 elite Mamluk cavalry under Sultan Qutuz. Kitbuka commanded between 10,000 and 20,000 men, significantly outnumbered, because Hulagu Khan had returned to Mongolia following the death of the great Khan monk, leaving only a fraction of his force behind. The battle was intense. The Mamluks, using tactics inspired by their enemies, executed a feigned retreat to lure the Mongols into a trap, a tactic that had crushed the Khwarezmian Empire and countless others. This time, the Mongols themselves were trapped, as Qutuz charged personally into the fray, reportedly shouting, "Wah! Islam! Oh my Islam!" Morale exploded across the Mamluk lines. Kitbuka fought valiantly, but was ultimately captured and executed. The Mongols had suffered their first decisive defeat in a pitched battle. Ain Jalut did more than save Egypt. It saved the Islamic world from the fate that had befallen Baghdad, reshaping the power dynamics of the Middle East. This victory, however, posed a dilemma for the Christian kingdoms. The Mamluks became the dominant regional power and enemies of the remaining Crusader states. A small Christian kingdom on the Mediterranean coast, Armenian Cilicia, found itself precariously situated between warring superpowers. In 1247, King Hitam had made a bold and controversial choice. He voluntarily submitted to the Mongols. He traveled thousands of miles across deserts and mountains to meet the great Khan monk at Karakorum. This was not an act of cowardice, but of pragmatism. He calculated that survival required alignment with a stronger power, even if it meant compromising with a former enemy. The strategy initially paid off. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, Armenian troops fought alongside them. When they captured Damascus in 1260, Cilician forces were present. In return, the Mongols shielded Armenia from Mamluk and Seljuk aggression. But Ain Jalut changed everything. The Mamluks emerged as a dominant force in the region and remembered Armenian support for the Mongols. In 1266, Sultan Baybars exacted revenge. Cities were razed, civilians massacred, and Hitam's sons were killed or taken prisoner. Hitam's alliance remains a stark reminder that in history, choices are rarely between good and evil. Often, they are between bad and less bad options. Without the Mongol alliance, Armenia might have been destroyed even sooner. Yet this decision made Armenia a target once circumstances shifted. By the late 13th century, Cilicia faced existential threats. Mamluks pressing from the south, Turkish principalities from the west, and a Mongol empire increasingly preoccupied with internal strife. Amid this desperate situation, a new opportunity emerged from Persia, not Europe. Ghazan Khan's conversion to Islam in 1295 brought the Mongols and Armenian forces into an unlikely alignment. Ghazan, now ruling the Ilkhanate in Persia, saw potential in forging coalitions with Christians and local powers to push back the Mamluks. By 1299, the stage was set. An improbable coalition, Mongol, Armenian, Georgian, and Turkish, prepared to confront the dominant Mamluk Sultanate on the plains of Wadi al-Haznadar. This coalition illustrates the unpredictability of history. Forces that were once mortal enemies could align when interests converged, demonstrating how shifting political landscapes can create strange alliances. Yet the paradox runs deeper. The Mongols, responsible for the deaths of millions of Muslims, became the last hope of Christians in the Levant. The Armenian kingdom, punished for its earlier pragmatism, now fought alongside Mongols against former Muslim neighbors. History rarely adheres to simple moral categories. It operates on logic, necessity, and survival. What makes Wadi al-Hasnadar particularly remarkable is the insight it provides into strategy, power, and human agency. Alliances formed not out of shared ideology, but out of converging survival interests. Decisions made decades earlier, Hitam's submission, the Mongol campaigns, Baibar's rise, shaped the context in which leaders acted. A king's pragmatic choice, a general's battlefield ingenuity, or the conversion of an emperor could have consequences decades later, influencing decisions and outcomes in ways no one could fully anticipate. The battle also underscores the importance of timing and adaptation. Ghazan Khan leveraged the weaknesses of the Mamluks and the desperation of his allies, while the Mamluks relied on tactical brilliance, discipline, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. In many ways, Wadi al-Hasnadar was a culmination of lessons learned over decades of Mongol campaigns in the Middle East. The limits of mobility, the value of local alliances, and the role of leadership in unpredictable circumstances. Ultimately, the events surrounding Wadi al-Hasnadar, Ain Jalut, and Armenian Cilicia illustrate the complex dynamics of power. Military might alone does not determine outcomes. Context, alliances, and strategic choices often prove decisive. History is not a straight line, but a web of interactions, unintended consequences, and paradoxical alignments. So, the next time you reflect on history, consider this. The Mongols, the scourge of the Islamic world, became temporary allies of Christian kingdoms. The Mamluks, facing annihilation, rose to dominate the Middle East. And a small kingdom like Armenia navigated survival through pragmatism, suffering, and resilience. The story challenges simple narratives and highlights the importance of strategic thinking, flexibility, and understanding the long-term consequences of actions. Wherever you are watching from, consider how alliances, timing, and context shape your own challenges. And remember that in history, the most improbable outcomes often produce the most lasting lessons. In 1295, something unexpected happened. Ghazan Khan, great-grandson of Hulagu Khan, converted to Islam. Let that sink in. His great-grandfather had massacred hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Baghdad, destroyed the House of Wisdom, and executed Caliph al-Mustasim by wrapping him in a carpet and trampling him to death, because Mongol law forbade spilling royal blood. And now, his descendant was embracing the very faith his ancestors had terrorized. Why? The answer isn't simple. Ghazan wasn't a fanatic. He was described as highly intelligent, multilingual, fluent in Mongolian, Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Tibetan, and even Frankish, and deeply interested in science, astronomy, and history. His conversion was partly political. It helped him gain the loyalty of his Muslim army in the Ilkhanate, which was essential to secure his throne. But there was also a deeper reason. Most of his subjects were Muslim, and conversion legitimized his rule in their eyes. Yet Ghazan's adoption of Islam did not stop him from waging war against the Mamluks, also Muslims. For him, this was not about religion, it was about power. The Mamluks had humiliated the Mongol Empire at Ain Jalut decades earlier, and that defeat could not stand. He framed his campaign as a theological mission, claiming in letters to the Mamluks that he was God's chosen instrument to purify Islam from corruption, accusing the Mamluk sultans of tyranny. It was a clever rhetorical strategy, blending political necessity with religious legitimacy. Ghazan's strategic problem, however, was alliances. Few were willing to fight beside a Muslim Mongol emperor. The only viable allies were the Christians, who had historically been protected by his ancestors. This brings us to summer 1299, when Armenia's King Hitam II, grandson of Hitam I, sent a desperate plea to Ghazan. In response, Ghazan assembled one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse armies the Middle East had ever seen. Imagine yourself as a Syrian peasant in fall 1299. The army approaches. First, 60,000 Mongol cavalry, mounted on small, hardy horses and armed with composite bows. Behind them come 40,000 Georgian warriors, Orthodox Christians clad in heavy armor, their shields bearing crosses. Then 5,000 elite Armenian Cilician cavalry under Hitam II, also Christian, motivated by vengeance against the Mamluks, who had devastated their homeland. Scattered among them, according to some sources, though disputed, were Templar and Hospitaller knights from Cyprus and Armenia. All were commanded by Ghazan Khan, a Muslim Mongol emperor. Their goal: defeat the Mamluks and reclaim Syria. For the Christians in the coalition, there was a deeper hope: the recovery of Jerusalem. Ghazan had promised European powers that he would return the city to Christian control if they assisted him against the Mamluks. While European monarchs largely ignored these promises, distracted by their own wars, the surviving Crusader orders saw this as perhaps their last opportunity to regain a foothold in the Holy Land. Between 1299 and 1303, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, attempted to coordinate with Ghazan. He tried to convince European kings to send forces, and even led a small fleet to raid the Syrian coast in 1300, accompanied by Mongol envoys. But Europe had turned away from the Crusades, leaving Ghazan to rely on local allies. By December 22, 1299, at 5 a.m., near Homs, Syria, the Mongol coalition formed on the plains of Wadi al-Hasnadar. Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, commanding 20,000 to 30,000 elite cavalry, the warriors who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut 39 years prior, surveyed the enemy. Despite their skill, the Mamluks faced overwhelming numbers, and this was not the same force Kibuka had led decades before. This was Ghazan Khan's army, disciplined, diverse, and larger than anything the Levant had seen in decades. The sun rose and the battle began. The Mamluks charged, attempting to break through Mongol lines. Their heavy horses, thick armor, and training in close combat gave them an advantage in frontal engagements. But they were fighting in unfamiliar territory against a commander who had studied their tactics. Ghazan's army had a strategic depth that Kibuka's force had lacked. Mongol horse archers could envelop, flank, and strike from unexpected angles, while Armenian and Georgian troops secured the flanks and reserves. Every element of Ghazan's army complemented the others. What makes this moment so striking is the paradox of history. The Mongols, who had once been the scourge of the Muslim world, were now defending Christian allies' interests and challenging Muslim powers. The Armenians, who had suffered under Mamluk attacks, found themselves fighting alongside Mongols who had historically been their overlords. And the Mamluks, who had once saved the Islamic world from Mongol conquest, were again being challenged by the same empire. History, in this instance, defied expectations and moral binaries. Loyalty, religion, and politics intertwined in unpredictable ways. The Battle of Wadi al-Hasnadar demonstrates how context shapes outcomes. Ghazan's conversion, once seen as merely religious, became a tool of political legitimacy. His coalition, improbable as it was, leveraged mutual interests to achieve strategic aims. The Mamluks, formidable as they were, faced an opponent whose organizational genius, combined with tactical diversity, numerical advantage, and psychological preparation, proved overwhelming. For the Christians, it was a fleeting chance to reclaim lost prestige and territory. For Ghazan, it was the assertion of Mongol power in Syria and a step toward restoring the empire's honor. And this is where the political and military complexity of the region became clear. As the Mamluks fled south toward Damascus, they were not just pursued by Mongols. Local forces, approximately 12,000 Maronite and Druze archers, both Christian and Muslim, attacked them. These Syrian locals resented Mamluk rule and saw the Mongol advance as an opportunity to assert their autonomy. They struck relentlessly, harassing the retreating Mamluks and cutting off stragglers. The rout extended all the way to Gaza. By late December or early January, Damascus had surrendered. Mongol forces under General Mo even conducted deep raids into Palestine. News of these victories spread across Europe with a sense of miraculous optimism. Rumors claimed that Jerusalem had been liberated and that the Crusades, at last, had succeeded. Churches held Thanksgiving services. Merchants dreamed of renewed trade routes, and kings considered sending reinforcements to solidify gains. For a few months, hope flourished, but the reality in Syria was far more complicated. Yes, the Mongols had captured Damascus. Yes, they had defeated the Mamluks in open battle. Yes, raids had extended into Palestine. But Jerusalem? Most sources, Armenian, European, Mamluk, and even Mongol, offer no confirmation that the city was actually occupied. At best, Armenian chronicles mention King Hitam II visiting Jerusalem briefly, but no real administrative control was established. By then, Jerusalem was a small, desolate town, lacking strategic significance. Ghazan's focus was Damascus and Aleppo, cities with real economic, political, and military value. For Europeans, however, the nuances didn't matter. They wanted to believe a miracle had occurred, and for a brief moment, they did. By February 1300, however, the Mongols began withdrawing most of their forces back to Persia. Several factors contributed to this. Some historians suggest that the Syrian countryside, already devastated by war, could no longer sustain such a large army. Grazing for horses and fodder for camels and supplies had become scarce. Others point to political pressures. Ghazan had received intelligence about potential threats from the Ilkhanate in Central Asia and needed to secure his eastern borders. Whatever the reason, the effect was immediate. The Mongol army left, retaining only a smaller contingent of about 10,000 men under General Mull. The Mamluks wasted no time. Led by capable commanders like Badr al-Jamali and al-Jasniger, they regrouped quickly. By May 1300, they counterattacked. Mull's force was too small to resist effectively and was forced to retreat. Damascus fell back into Mamluk hands, and Armenian hopes, tied to Mongol intervention, were dashed. Ghazan had promised to return in the winter of 1300 to 1301 to mount an assault on Egypt, but he never arrived. The Mongols tried again in 1301, but bad weather and logistical difficulties hindered their advance. In 1303, they launched a final attempt, this time fielding a massive army of approximately 80,000, supplemented by Armenian troops. These would prove decisive encounters. At Homs on March 30th, and later at the Battle of Shakab near Damascus on April 21st, the Mongols were defeated decisively. Unlike Wadi al-Hasnadar, there was no uncertainty this time. The Mamluks had adapted, learned from previous mistakes, and successfully countered Mongol tactics. The battle marked the end of large-scale Mongol invasions of Syria. Ghazan Khan died in May 1304 at only 32 years of age. With his death, any hope for a Mongol Christian coalition against the Mamluks evaporated. The Crusader presence in the Levant dwindled. Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templar attempted to maintain a foothold on Rad, a small island off the Syrian coast, hoping that Mongol support would return. But in 1302, the Mamluks besieged the island. The Templars fought valiantly, but ultimately surrendered under promises of safe passage, which were broken. The Knights were executed. This event effectively ended Crusader control on the mainland. Jerusalem would not return to Christian hands until 1917, when the British captured it from the Ottoman Empire. So, did the Mongols save the Crusaders? The answer depends on perspective. If you asked Hitam II in December 1299, after the victory at Wadi al-Hasnadar, he likely would have said yes. Armenia had regained lost territory, the Mamluks had been defeated, and Jerusalem seemed within reach. But history is rarely that simple. Temporary victories can inspire hope, yet without sustained strategic follow-through, they may evaporate. The Mongols' campaign of 1299 to 1303 highlights the complexities of alliance politics, geography, logistics, and timing in medieval warfare. It also underscores how fleeting victories can be misinterpreted as lasting miracles. In the end, Wadi al-Hasnadar stands as a paradoxical episode in history. A Mongol army, whose ancestors had terrorized the Muslim world, became a temporary protector for Christian forces. Armenian and Georgian troops, once subject to Mongol overlords, fought alongside them. The Mamluks, defenders of Islam against Mongol invasion, faced both spiritual and military challenges. And yet, despite initial Mongol success, the established powers reasserted control, demonstrating the limits of even the most disciplined, diverse, and technologically advanced armies when politics, terrain, and logistics are misaligned. History, in this case, defies simplistic narratives. Victories can be fleeting, alliances temporary, and the consequences of decisions often only visible decades later. But if you'd asked him in 1304, after final defeat, when the Mamluks had retaken everything Armenia had lost, when Ghazan was dead, and when the last hope had evaporated, the answer would have been very different. The truth is, the Mongols didn't save the Crusades. They only gave them a brief hope, a temporary victory, a moment when everything seemed possible. In the end, it was only a delay of the inevitable. Yet there is something remarkable about those moments in 1299 and 1300, when that multi-ethnic and multi-religious army fought side by side. They proved something important. Alliances in history rarely follow the neat religious or cultural boundaries we imagine. A Muslim Mongol emperor could fight alongside Christian kings against Muslim sultans. Syrian Maronite and Druze archers could strike Egyptian Mamluk troops despite sharing the same faith. Power politics, as always, was far more complex than the simple stories we tell. Think about the choices these historical figures faced. Hiram II in 1247 had to decide between fighting the Mongols and facing certain destruction, or submitting to them, and buying a chance at survival. He chose survival. Some call that betrayal, others pragmatism, but it allowed Armenian Cilicia to exist for another century. Ghazan Khan in 1295 had to choose between maintaining his ancestral Mongol religion, risking opposition from most of his population, or converting to Islam to rule more effectively. He chose conversion. Did that make him less Mongol, or simply a wise and pragmatic leader? Jacques de Molay, from 1299 to 1302, had to decide whether to continue hoping for Mongol support and risk his knights' lives on Rued or to accept the loss of the Holy Land. He chose hope. Did it get him killed? Not immediately. That would happen 5 years later, when King Philip IV of France arrested him. But did it make him foolish? Or did it make him the last man to still believe in a dream that was already fading? These are questions without easy answers. This is why the story of Wadi al-Hasnadar matters. The battle itself was not a world-changing victory. It didn't save the Crusades. It didn't liberate Jerusalem. And within a few years, everything gained was lost. Yet it matters for 3 critical reasons. First, it shows that history is rarely a simple story of us versus them. It is not just Christians versus Muslims, East versus West, Mongols versus Arabs. History is a complex web of interests, alliances, and choices made by real people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Decisions were often dictated by survival, not ideology. Second, it reminds us that short-term victories don't guarantee long-term success. Ghazan Khan won at Wadi al-Hasnadar, but he couldn't maintain that advantage. Strategy isn't just about winning battles. It is about holding what you gain. It requires resources, logistics, political support, and reliable allies. Ghazan had only a temporary coalition. Once his priorities shifted, the victory evaporated. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it teaches us about the fragile nature of hope. The Crusaders in Cyprus, the Templar Knights, and the Armenians all clung to the Mongols as saviors. For a few brief months, it seemed plausible. But hope based solely on the strength of others is inherently unstable. It can vanish overnight. The Crusades didn't fail due to a lack of military courage. They failed because Europe no longer possessed the will to sustain them. Local kingdoms were too small, too weak, and depended on alliances that could not be trusted. They placed their faith in a Mongol empire beset by internal conflicts, civil wars, and competing priorities. This isn't a story of cowardice, betrayal, or simple military failure. It is a story of the mathematics of power. Sometimes, no matter how valiantly you fight, the numbers simply don't favor you. Wadi al-Hasnadar illustrates how strategy, logistics, politics, and timing are as crucial as courage or skill on the battlefield. Looking back, several lessons emerge. 1. Be wary of alliances built solely on a common enemy rather than aligned interests. The Mongols and Crusaders shared a mutual hatred of the Mamluks, but not the same ultimate goals. When Ghazan's priorities changed, the alliance collapsed immediately. 2. Desperate situations force imperfect choices. Hiram II, Ghazan Khan, and Jacques de Molay all made decisions that appear controversial in hindsight, but they acted with the information available and under enormous constraints. Judging them from a safe historical distance is easy. Understanding their context is far harder. 3. Military victory alone is never enough. Victory must be consolidated with political strategy economic support, and sustained commitment. Wadi al-Hasnadar was tactically brilliant, but it lacked the infrastructure and follow-through to create lasting change. For history rarely offers neat endings. Sometimes the good guys lose. Sometimes fleeting victories vanish without trace. Sometimes hope is crushed despite courage and preparation. Yet these stories remain essential because they illuminate the complexity of human struggle. They show that decisions are rarely simple, that alliances are fragile, and that even brilliant victories can amount to nothing if not properly managed. So, when reflecting on the lessons of Wadi al-Hasnadar, we see more than military history. We see the fragility of hope, the intricacies of power, and the courage of individuals navigating impossible choices. History teaches that outcomes are rarely linear, victories rarely permanent, and allegiances always conditional. And now, a question for you. If you were Hiram II in 1299, facing the collapse of your kingdom and the rise of a Mongol Muslim coalition, what would you have done? Would you have allied with Ghazan Khan, placing your fate in the hands of foreign power for the slim hope of regaining lost territory? Or would you have accepted that the era of crusades was over and sought peace with the Mamluks? There is no objectively correct answer. But considering the stakes, the risks, and the consequences, your choice would reveal much about strategy, pragmatism, and the nature of leadership in desperate times. History is full of such moments, and while the Crusades ultimately failed, the story of Wadi al-Hasnadar reminds us why those choices, and the people who made them, remain worth studying. Courage, hope, pragmatism, and human complexity. They're the real legacies of battles that, on paper, may seem like mere footnotes,